All right. Hello again, everyone. It's 1 minute past the hour by my time. So I want to wish everyone a good morning from the Philippines, but also good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to friends and guests who are joining us from other parts of the globe. My name is Daniel C. Ratilla, the focal point of the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, and I will be serving as your host and moderator for today's event. Today is the final session of the 2026 Climate Research as If People Mattered webinar series. The title of the webinar series draws from the article Small is Beautiful, Climate Change Science as If People Mattered, which was written by Dr. Regina Rodriguez and Dr. Theodore Shepard, co-chairs of the My Climate Risk Lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program. It reflects on insights from E.F. Schumacher's celebrated book, Small is Beautiful, that may be applied in closing the gap between how climate information is being produced and used. In April, we began the 2026 series with the Climate Voices from the Ground, Perspectives from Different Sectors series, where we explored the different contexts and experiences of climate change in the Global South. In this climate research series, we see how these perspectives might then inform how we structure our research and management plans. This series is organized by the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, which is hosted by the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability. Our session today is also co-hosted by the Ateneo Research Institute of Science and Engineering, a collaborating institute of the Hub. My Climate Risk, or MCR, is a lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program with a mycorrhizal hub of a network of 21 hubs spread across the globe, which aims to develop and mainstream a bottom-up approach to understanding regional climate risk. Just some reminders before we start. Please note that the program is being recorded on Zoom. Here on Zoom, all participants are muted automatically as they enter the meeting room. We also encourage participants to keep their cameras off throughout the event, except during the group picture taking. Throughout the session, kindly type in any comments or questions in the chat box here on Zoom. Participants through Facebook Live may also type in their comments and questions in the comments section. But if you are feeling shy or would like to remain anonymous, please feel free to send our tech team a private message. So that's anyone with the letters MCR in front of their names. We will be collecting these for the open forum later on. And finally, there will be an evaluation survey at the end of the session. Requests for e-certificates may be made through the same form. At this point, we would like to ask everyone to settle in for an interfaith prayer, and I invite everyone to make the sign of their faith or to join us in meaningful contemplation. You may join me as I recite the benediction from the Native American tradition. All-sustaining Spirit, you encircle space and time. You swirl and sing through every season. In silent stillness, you settle deep into the soul of creation. Your sacred wisdom has come to us this day in the words of ancient truth, through the words of present-day prophets, for the ones whose future well-being is formed by our response today. May our actions be formed by what has been spoken and heard and felt here today. Make us wise and faithful stewards of creation, sustained by your Spirit forevermore. Amen. And now, to formally welcome everyone to today's webinar, we are pleased to share a message by Engineer Maria Leonora Huico, the Executive Director of the Ateneo Research Institute of Science and Engineering. Engineer Huico is also a collaborator of the MCR-Ateneo Hub.
Good day to everyone and a warm welcome to today's session of the Climate Research Webinar Series, As If People Mattered, organized by My Climate Risk, the Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub. This webinar series was created to deepen conversations on climate change science and climate risk management through bottom-up, people-centered approaches. We recognize that climate risks are not experienced equally, and the voices of communities must remain at the center of both research and action. In the context of Southeast Asia and the Global South, where climate impacts are immediate and deeply intertwined with livelihoods, culture, and inequality, it is absolutely vital to ground our research in lived realities. Today's webinar, entitled Community Perspectives on Coastal Resilience, a baseline assessment of free coastal barangays in Sablayan, Occidental Mindoro, perfectly reflects that commitment. Coastal communities are among the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, facing everything from sea level rise and coastal erosion to stronger typhoons and threats to food security. Yet, these communities are not just passive victims. They are active sources of knowledge, adaptation practices, and resilience that are too often overlooked in formal research and policy discussions. This study examines coastal resilience in three coastal barangays, Poblacion, Buenavista, and Santo Niño, in Sablayan, Occidental Mindoro, through a community-based research approach. Our speaker, Ms. Alyssa Kemp, will share insights from stakeholder focus group discussions, participatory community mapping exercises, and key informant interviews representing disaster management, planning, environment, fisheries, tourism, and community leadership sectors. More importantly, she will discuss how these perspectives can inform more inclusive, locally grounded resilience efforts. Findings indicate that all three barangays demonstrate strong disaster preparedness, community cooperation, and local environmental knowledge. Participants also identified recurring challenges related to flooding, erosion, infrastructure limitations, livelihood vulnerability, and long-term environmental change. Importantly, community members possess detailed knowledge of local hazards, protective features, evacuation needs, and resilience priorities that may not be fully reflected in technical assessments alone. By listening to local voices, we move closer to climate solutions that are not only scientifically sound, but also socially relevant, equitable, and responsive to people's actual needs. We are deeply honored to have with us today our speakers, researchers, community partners, and participants. Your presence reflects a shared commitment to advancing climate research that truly serves people. On behalf of my climate risk, the Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, thank you for joining us today. We hope this webinar becomes a meaningful space for learning, dialogue, and collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Engineer Rico, and of course, thank you as well to the team at the ARISE Lab. Indeed, we as researchers are also called to practice what we call epistemic humility in recognizing that expertise also exists outside traditional centers of learning. It is now my pleasure, sorry, to introduce our speaker for today. Alyssa Kemp is an environmental engineer and graduate of Drexel University, where she earned both a bachelor's and a master's in environmental engineering. Their work focuses on climate resilience planning, water resources, and community engagement. She brings together technical approaches and local knowledge to support more inclusive and effective decision-making. A Truman Scholar and Fulbright Fellow, she is currently based in the Philippines and works with coastal communities in Occidental Mindoro. Their experience includes community-based climate research, stakeholder engagement, and environmental justice initiatives. She's especially interested in how engineering can better reflect the lived realities of communities facing climate change and disaster risk. Members of the audience, please join me in welcoming our speaker for today's session, Ms. Alyssa Kemp. Alyssa, welcome back from the field. The floor is yours.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'll just take a moment to share my screen. All right. Okay, so yeah, hello everyone. As Daniel said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, just to hit all the time zones. Thank you for being here today. I'm really excited to share my work. As previously mentioned, my name is Alyssa Kemp, and I'm presenting my Fulbright research project titled Community Perspectives on Coastal Resilience, a baseline assessment of 3 coastal barangays in Sablayan, Occidental Mindoro, and really, this project was trying to explore how coastal communities understand and experience resilience in the face of coastal hazards and how community perspectives can help inform more locally grounded resilience planning efforts. So, going on to the next slide. So, before diving into the project itself, I know you've already heard a lot about me, but I wanted to again briefly introduce myself and explain how I've arrived to this work. So originally, I grew up in a small town in rural America that was flood prone, and I've experienced evacuations throughout my lifetime. This led me to being interested in disaster management, flooding, and water resources. So I went on to earn my bachelor's and master's degrees in environmental engineering. And much of that work focused on the intersection of climate resilience, community engagement, and policy. Now, what brought me to the Philippines is the Fulbright program, which supports international academic exchange and community-based research focused on knowledge sharing and cross-cultural understanding. So now, before moving on, I just wanted to bring us on the same playing field of a definition for coastal resilience. So I'm using the definition from Maslink and Lazarus, and this definition states coastal resilience is the capacity of the socioeconomic and natural systems in the coastal environment to cope with disturbances induced by factors such as sea level rise, extreme events, and human impacts by adapting whilst maintaining their essential functions. Now, I know that is a lot, especially if you're not in the academics of resilience. So, to break it down, importantly, resilience is not only environmental, it's shaped through the interaction of ecosystems, governance systems, infrastructures, and communities. Environmental systems like reefs, mangroves, shoreline all help with the stability and play protective roles. Institutions like disaster risk reduction planning and marine protected area management also shape resilience outcomes. And at the same time, resilience is deeply connected to communities themselves, including preparedness, social networks, local knowledge, and access to resources. Because of all of this, understanding resilience requires looking not only at the physical hazards at play, but also at how communities experience and respond to them. So now onto the project itself. As mentioned, it's examining coastal resilience across 3 coastal barangays, which, to bring a definition into a global perspective, a barangay is like a large neighborhood. And this area is experiencing exposure to flooding, storm surge, coastal erosion, and other coastal hazards. This project seeks to better understand how different stakeholder groups experience and define resilience, what strengths and vulnerabilities shape preparedness and recovery in this region, and where gaps exist between hazard exposure protections, infrastructures, and planning systems. Ultimately, the goal of this work is to support more community informed and locally grounded approaches to coastal resilience and disaster preparedness planning in this region. So to bring you all into where I've been living for the past 6 months to do the field work, these are the 3 barangay locations, which are located in Sablayan, Occidental Mindoro, which is the largest municipality in the province of Occidental Mindoro, which is just south of Manila. It's still in the northern part of the Philippines. So Sablayan was selected because of its strong relationship to coastal livelihoods, marine protected areas, which are highlighted in the blue shaded sections on this map, and also the nearby Apple Reef National Park, which is about 15 nautical miles west of Sablayan, and it's one of the largest connected coral reef systems in the world. Sablayan was also recognized recently as a biosphere reserve by UNESCO, so it's also a designated territory of ecological significance on that level. And despite all of this, this region faces increasing exposure to coastal hazards. Now, despite the importance of this region, there's relatively limited research that focuses on the community level coastal resilience within the area. A lot of the research is focused more on the biological side. So the 3 barangays selected, Poblacion, Buenavista, and Santo Niño, were chosen to capture different community experiences and priorities within the same municipal context. And also, they're close together, and as the sole field researcher for this project, it made my capability to move between the barangays more feasible. And these barangays represent roughly 30% of the population across Sablayan's 22 barangays, so making up a third of the municipal itself. Now, moving on to the data collection. So this project used stakeholder focus group discussions and participatory community mapping to better understand how different groups within the coastal communities experience and define resilience. Across the 3 barangays, a total of 8 focus group discussions and mapping activities were completed with 31 participants. One of the tourism stakeholder meetings was not completed in the barangay Buenavista, so 8 in total. Focus groups were conducted with women, fisherfolk, and tourism or service link stakeholders, depending on the barangay context. These groups were selected because they interact with coastal systems and hazards in different ways and often experience different vulnerabilities, responsibilities, and recovery pressures. The use of separate stakeholder meetings also helped create more open discussion spaces and allowed participants to speak more freely about their experiences. I incorporated participatory community mapping because I believe residents possess valuable local environmental knowledge about hazards, protections, evacuation systems, and vulnerable areas that can help it inform planning for the region. In addition to the focus groups, this project also included 10 key informant interviews, or KIIs, with individuals working across disaster management, planning, environment, agriculture, tourism, community leadership, and barangay governance. I used both focus group discussions and KIIs because it captured the perspectives across household, livelihood, and institutional scales. So now moving on to the qualitative analysis before getting into the results. So the participatory mapping outcomes were synthesized comparatively to identify overlapping hazard zones, protective features, evacuation areas, and planning gaps across groups. I know that sounds like a mouthful, but once you see the map, it'll make more sense. Then the descriptive coding was used to organize reoccurring topics discussed by participants, including things like flooding, erosion, evacuation, livelihoods, governance, and coastal protection, among many other code words. Thematic analysis and stakeholder comparison were then used to examine how resilience priorities and vulnerabilities differed across stakeholder groups, livelihoods, institutional roles, and relationships to the coastal systems. Findings were then interpreted through a climate resilience framework, which means I was focused at looking at exposure, vulnerability, preparedness, adaptive capacity, and recovery. And overall, the purpose of the qualitative analysis was to help center the lived experiences, local environmental knowledge, and community understandings of resilience itself. All right, so now to the fun part, the results. So we're going to start first with a barangay population. I'm a bit impartial to this barangay because this is where I lived during this research project. I just want to take note that the background image for this slide is actually population. So you can see how beautiful this area is and how stunning the ocean is along this coastline. And before I actually started the focus group discussions during my research project, I asked the participants to describe their barangay in one word. Some of the words folks used in population were organized, dependable, economically active, community-oriented, and coastal. So you can kind of get a picture of what this community is like without even going there. Now, this is the compiled community mapping, which combines perspectives from all stakeholder groups across barangay population. So it includes the women, the fisherfolk, and the tourism residents. And now during the mapping activities, participants were asked to identify hazard zones, protective features, evacuation safe areas, and locations they believed required greater planning attention. In this map, red areas represent hazard zones identified by participants, including areas vulnerable to flooding, storm surge, erosion, landslides, wave impacts. And to note, this map acts like a heat map. So the darker color of red indicates that more participants took note of that area, similar with darker shades of blue as well. So the blue areas represent protective features such as reefs, mangroves, seawalls, and the triangles indicate evacuation or safe areas. And then later on, the yellow outline areas will represent priority intervention zones identified through the compiled analysis. So, as you can see across all groups, participants consistently identified the coastline areas as highly exposed to flooding, storm surge, erosion, landslides, and wave impacts, as you can see by the dark red color. Protective features such as reefs around the coastline, mangroves actually within the community itself, and 2 seawalls were also identified through this, but the protections appear more fragmented and unevenly distributed as you see sections of the barangay with no protective features. Evacuation and safe areas were concentrated near the barangay center, and also to note, there is no official evacuation center in barangay population. They use the barangay hall or the community hall and the local elementary school. So this suggests that access to evacuation centers could be more limited the further away you are from the center of the community. Now, from this analysis, 3 priority zones emerged. You have this first zone along the central coastline, which showed strong hazard exposure with only partial protective coverage. You have priority zone 2, which is around this area called Parola Park. This showed high exposure, and it's also important to take note because Parola Park is a tourist destination for population as well. And then you have zone 3, which stretched along the southern coastal stretch. It showed this continued hazard exposure while evacuation access and protective features become more and more limited. So this mapping exercise provides this important insight into how participants spatially understood their hazards, protections, safe areas, and experiences across the barangay. Now we will look at the analysis of what was said during the focus group discussion. So, across the stakeholder groups, participants consistently stated a strong barangay response system to disasters, high community cooperation and trust, strong awareness to local hazards, and existing natural and institutional resources like community support networks, warning systems, and just overall evacuation coordination in this community. At the same time, there are several ongoing challenges in this community. There's recurrent flooding and storm surge, inadequate evacuation facilities, as I mentioned, There are also the current evacuation facilities lack enough beds, lack enough bathrooms, and sometimes lack enough meal supplies during disasters. There is also livelihood sensitivities to storms because there are a lot of fisher folks in this community. There's uneven coastal protection coverage, as I've stated, and there is a need for stronger community participation in planning. So these findings also point to several important planning priorities and opportunities. So these priorities are organized across immediate, medium-term, and long-term actions or ideas to start thinking about to strengthen coastal resilience in this area. In the medium term, community members emphasize the need to improve evacuation conditions and sanitation, maintain and strengthen the warning systems, and maintain the evacuation access during emergencies. In the medium term, participants wanted to improve drainage areas and flood-prone areas. And keep note of this, drainage comes up across all three barangays as a point of improvement. Also improving livelihood, recovery, and support mechanisms, starting to create regular stakeholder consultation forums as well. And then in the long term, it would be great to have a dedicated evacuation center being developed, looking at mangrove restoration and coastal buffers. There's actually a quite beautiful mangrove park in this community already, so supporting the development of that, the continued development of that. And then finally, creating this formal mechanism for continuous community participation throughout planning processes and governance processes. So next up, Barangay Buena Vista. Again, in the background of the slide, you can see Buena Vista, another beautiful community, and residents describe Barangay Buena Vista as progressive, developing, united, improving, and coastal. So again, this map combines perspectives from both stakeholder groups. Reminder that there was no tourism stakeholder group in this community. Just as a reminder, red is hazard zones, blue protective features, and the red triangles are the evacuation sites. So across both groups, participants consistently identified the western coastline and this fish port area as some of the most exposed sections of the barangay, as well as this section inside the community as well, because it has a lower elevation point. The protective features were also noted, like the mangrove sections highlighted in blue. And while residents viewed these ecosystems as important protections, participants emphasized that these protective systems remain fragmented and unevenly distributed across the coastline. Again, the blue triangles identify evacuation and safe areas, which again were concentrated near the barangay center and municipal facilities. There is again no formal evacuation center here in Buena Vista. They use the barangay hall, elementary schools, a sports complex as well. And to take note, the area to the west is like a little separate island that's connected to the mainland by a hanging bridge only. So wood suspension bridge with rope. So it's important to note that evacuation access becomes challenging in these more exposed coastal sections because there is only a hanging bridge to connect. So if there isn't an early evacuation center, it's very hard to reach the center of this barangay to reach those facilities. So again, looking at this map, 3 intervention zones emerged. There is Priority Zone 1, which is this western coastline area. This zone showed some of the highest levels of storm surge exposure, erosion risk, and fisheries livelihood and vulnerability, according to the participants. They also emphasized the importance of shoreline protection and maintaining marine access in this area, as again, one of the highest employment opportunities are fishing or fisheries in this neighborhood as well. The next region would be this river connected area. So between the little island inlet and mainland, there is a river that runs between the two. And residents repeatedly identified flooding, standing water, and sanitation concerns in these sections, especially during heavy rainfall and storm events. And the last section is this central coastal corridor along this main roadway. And participants identified this area as important for evacuation movement and transportation access, while also raising major concerns regarding flooding and drainage limitations. So similar to Poblation, the strengths for Buena Vista were quite the same. It was strong barangay disaster response, high community cooperation and trust, awareness of local hazards, and these existing marine and coastal protection systems. Again, there are several challenges to take note of. The flooding and drainage concerns were raised repeatedly across discussions, particularly in those low-lying sections and river-connected areas. And participants also discussed major sanitation and sewage concerns in this area that worsen during storm events. Fisher folks participants especially emphasized the vulnerability of fisheries livelihoods to storms, fuel costs, and disruptions in marine access. And another important finding involved concerns surrounding consultation and marine governance. Some participants expressed a desire for stronger engagement in decisions related to fisheries management and coastal planning. So again, this leads to several planning implications and community priority opportunities. So in the immediate term, residents emphasize the importance of improving drainage systems, reducing flood impacts, and addressing the sanitation concerns that worsen during heavy rainfall and storm events. It's important to note that Buena Vista's future planning has taken note of the poor drainage systems in the community and is already looking at that as well. In the medium term, participants highlighted the need to strengthen shoreline protections, support fisheries livelihoods, and improve the consultation process surrounding coastal and marine management. And then in the long term, it would be looking at more climate resilient infrastructure investment, especially towards that island offset of the mainland. That island is called Tabuk. It's where a large majority of residents live in Buena Vista, but a lot of flooding occurs. And as I said, currently there is really only a hanging bridge to get across between the two. Participants also discussed the importance of shoreline protection, seawall improvements. Across all communities, participants are very interested in the more development of seawalls throughout the coastline. Also looking at better transportation connectivity, and yeah, as I mentioned, trying to lessen the vulnerability of highly exposed coastal areas like that little island of Tabuk. Residents again emphasized the importance of balancing infrastructure development and ecosystem protection with stronger community participation in this coastal decision making. All right. Now on to Barangay Santo Niño. Again, the background images of Santo Niño. So you can see how lucky I was to get to live in Sablayan for this project. So the residents in Santo Niño described the barangay again as united, orderly, progressive, cooperative, and improving. You can see some of these words kind of match with one another. That might be because there's a strong sense of community in this area, but also this was the first time participants were speaking into the recorder. So a lot of folks were pretty shy at the start as well. All right, so this is the community mapping for Santo Niño. So again, the red is the hazard, the blue is protective features, blue triangles are the evacuation sites. So during the mapping exercises, participants again consistently identified the coastal and the river connected areas, which are to the west here, as highly exposed to flooding, erosion, storm impacts, and drainage overflow. And unlike some of the other barangays, discussions in Santo Niño really focused on the interaction between the river system, the mountain runoff, because there is mountains in the center of Mindoro that run off into this area, and drainage limitations and coastal flooding, all interacting in this section. Participants also described long-term environmental challenges here, which include the shrinking beaches, sediment buildup, shallower river systems, and increasing siltation in low-lying areas. The protective features identified by the participants included the mangroves, which highlight the sections between the ocean and the river system. That is a section of mangroves. Santo Niño is also the only barangay out of the 3 with a dedicated official evacuation center. So now moving on, after this analysis, 3 priority zones emerged as well. We have Zone 1, which is focused on this coastal river corridor where flooding, erosion, and drainage overflow were repeatedly identified across stakeholder groups. And we have Priority Zone 2, which focused on this very low-lying roadway and residential area where participants discussed standing water, very limited drainage flow, and transportation disruptions during storms. As you can see, this Mindoro West Coastal Road is the main highway throughout this community. And the last zone is focused on the river mouth and sedimentation areas where residents observed increasing siltation, environmental change, and long-term flood vulnerability, especially since there are several households that actually live in this river mouth area just due to proximity for fishing and lower cost of living. So next, we're again looking at what was said during the focus groups. So similarly, across all of these barangays, participants really noted the high community cooperation and trust, which makes sense. If you've ever been to the Philippines, this definitely is a value held throughout the Philippines. They also have high trust in emergency systems, very strong evacuation awareness, and very positive community support for marine conservation policies. There's actually a little safe haven for sea turtles in this community, and the community members I talked to were all for it. They had no issue with it, similarly to the other marine protected areas as well. Now, again, there are challenges in this community, so participants consistently identified river flooding, drainage limitations, erosion, siltation, and flood exposure of riverside housing as major long-term resilience concerns. Stakeholders also discussed how storms and flooding disrupt livelihoods across multiple sectors, including fishing, transportation, small businesses, and overall household income. So again, looking at the planning implications and community priorities from these findings, the immediate priorities focused on improving the drainage systems, addressing those flood-prone roadway areas, improving waste management and river cleanliness, and continuing the strong evacuation preparedness system that currently exists. In the medium term, it would be looking at more flood mitigation planning, especially around the river and drainage management, as well as creating community environmental education systems, which was great to see in this community that this was something brought up to start hosting environmental education lessons in the elementary, middle, high schools in this area, and also developing livelihood support during storm disruptions. In the long term, the priorities would center on larger investments, including river system and sediment management, relocation for those highly exposed areas, and continued ecosystem protection and restoration. So now looking at the barangay comparison, it's quite clear that several shared resilience strengths emerged consistently across all stakeholder groups. The strong disaster preparedness, community cooperation, and local coastal knowledge were clear in all of these neighborhoods. These similarities are likely connected to the shared context of the barangays' repeated exposure to typhoons and flooding events, the very strong social networks that exist in this area. Everyone knows each other. After living there for 6 months, I felt like I was known by everyone in this community, and also not only known, but looked after for. And yeah, and also active barangay level disaster response systems throughout Sablayan. So when it comes to resilience perception, Poblacion and Buena Vista showed more similar resilience concerns, particularly to the flooding, storm surge exposure, uneven coastal protection, and the need for more community participation. In contrast, Santo Nino discussions focus more heavily on the river systems, drainage limitations, sedimentation, and that flooding connected to the interaction between the river and coastal environment. So these findings kind of point to the fact that resilience planning in Sablayan should balance this municipality-wide strategies with these local level insights with barangay specific adaptations and infrastructure approaches. Now, to add on another layer of context with the key informant interview findings, so many of the KII findings reinforce concerns already raised by community stakeholders, particularly around flooding, erosion, storm impacts, the fisheries vulnerability, and infrastructure limitations. Interviewees also discussed how environmental changes such as siltation, stronger typhoons, and coastal erosion are all becoming more and more visible throughout the entire municipality of Sablayan itself. Some major themes within the KIIs was that many current systems remain more reactive than preventative, which is something I feel like we're used to hearing in the climate resilience space, is that a lot of these things are reactionary. Participants also frequently discuss the challenges related to funding limitations, drainage and infrastructure needs, the marine governance enforcement, and just overall the time and funding needed for long-term adaptation planning. Several KIIs also highlighted concerns around vulnerable housing areas and the long-term need for relocation planning in some of those highly exposed coastal and flood-prone areas, and making those relocation planning efforts affordable and feasible for folks, for example, coming from Tabuk to the mainland, where Tabuk, there's quite easy access to the marine resources, easy places to leave their boats, whereas moving to the mainland could shift things for that. Compared to the focus group discussions, the KIIs focus less on the day-to-day lived experiences and more on the governance systems, planning processes, environmental management, and overall the institutional constraints that we see in this area. Now, on to the limitations. As with a lot of community-based studies, there are several important limitations to acknowledge, especially as a foreigner doing this research in the Philippines itself. First of all, many of these discussions involve Tagalog to English translation. I have tried my best to learn Tagalog, but still, this translation may have affected some nuance, wording, or interpretation during this transcription and analysis during the qualitative analysis. The study also involved a relatively limited number of participants across stakeholder groups, meaning the findings are intended to reflect community perspectives and recurring themes rather than have statistically representative conclusions. Participants were also selected with assistance from barangay leadership, which definitely influenced which voices and perspectives were included in this discussion. And barangay leadership was utilized just because I was in this community for a short amount of time, trying to develop trust in this barangay itself. So leadership was able to create these connections for me to make this research possible. As I mentioned, one of the tourism stakeholder meetings was not completed, which slightly limited this cross-group comparison in one of the barangays. The assessment also focused specifically on 3 of the coastal barangays in Sablayan, so findings may not fully represent experiences across all of the coastal communities within this municipality. And finally, the project centered on community perspectives, lived experience, and participatory mapping rather than quantitative hazard modeling or engineering-based risk assessment. Despite these limitations, the study still provides valuable insight into how coastal resilience is experienced, understood, and prioritized at the barangay level in Sablayan itself. Now looking at the future opportunities and really vision for this work. So while this project focused on 3 barangays, it also has several opportunities for future work and continued collaboration. One opportunity is expanding this assessment to additional barangays in Sablayan to better understand how resilience, challenges, and priorities differ across the municipality. There's also the potential to integrate more spatial and technical analysis in the future work, including GIS-based hazard mapping, environmental monitoring, and this longer-term coastal change assessment. And then also looking at more longer-term monitoring with stakeholder groups and integration throughout the municipal planning systems. More broadly, this project hopes to help elevate local knowledge and lived experiences with climate adaptation and resilience discussions there in Sablayan. It aims to help identify community resilience priorities and planning needs that may support future resilience initiatives and infrastructure investments. And finally, the project really hopes to strengthen the collaboration between coastal communities, local government, and researchers working towards long-term resilience planning throughout the Philippines. To take note, I've given the same presentation to municipality leaders in Sablayan. I'm developing a report to give out to the municipality leaders, the barangay captains, as well as NGOs in the region, so that they continue using this research and really incorporating it in the planning, as well as hopefully developing upon and using this framework for community engagement for years to come in Sablayan. These are my references if you're interested at looking at them. And I just want to say thank you for joining, for your participation. I hope that what this project ultimately showed is that resilience cannot be understood only through hazard maps or infrastructure systems. Communities already possess such deep knowledge of environmental change, risk, and adaptation, and resilience planning becomes stronger when those perspectives are treated as expertise rather than simply a consultation. Now, I have a lot of thank yous to say. So first off, I have to thank the participants from the barangays and the community members itself from Poblacion, Buena Vista, and Santo Niños, as well as the local leadership and stakeholders and interview participants from the municipality leaders in Sablayan across agriculture, environment, planning, disaster offices, the barangay captain, and the Sablayan Mayor, Bong Marquez, for supporting this work, as well as thank you to Ateneo Institute of Sustainability and the Zoological Society of London, Philippines for supporting my efforts in my Fulbright application and throughout my time here, specifically Daniel, Doc Emmanuel, Ivy, Led, Patrick, Liz, Edwina from Zoological Society of London, and also Doc Emma. And again, thank you to Assistant Secretary Lillian D. Leon for supporting my work, everyone in Sablayan, and truly every Filipino I met along the way made this project happen and just made my time in the Philippines so memorable. So thank you. Yeah, thank you to everyone and to the Fulbright program and supporting partners. That is my presentation. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. That has been such a rich sharing, and I appreciate how you also approached this opportunity with such grace and with such humility. I especially appreciate how you really embodied the ethos that My Climate Risk really wants to bring to the mainstream of climate research, and that is recognizing that stakeholders really are experts in their own right, and that it is, of course, a very complex but interesting process to integrate their community knowledge with our more traditional academic sources of knowledge. And so at this point of the program, we will now be having our open forum. But before we move to our questions from the audience, I do have an initial question that I think might also be a useful guide for several of our participants in the call who might likewise be curious. And my question is about you as a researcher. Of course, we know that coming in as a researcher to any community, to any partner community, usually comes with its own power dynamics. There's usually that level of inequality between a local community and a researcher, because the perception of research and people who do research is, we come from a more from a higher seemingly untouchable area of power. So could you share more about how you socialized yourself with the community and how this experience was, especially as a foreigner here in the Philippines?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of power dynamics at play, even outside of a researcher, being white, being American. Yeah, definitely a lot happening. To break down the role of a researcher, I think the first thing that really helped is that I told all of the municipality leaders that this research project was not for a thesis. It was not for any academic publishment. What I was producing would be whatever they wanted to see that could best inform their future planning efforts. If it was this presentation, the mapping, a report I'm developing for them, I said, all of this materials are for you. So that helped break down the researcher role, because I wasn't trying to gain an academic publishment. I wasn't going to do this research and then disappear forever from Sablayan and never present anything to this community, which in Sablayan and across globally, I feel like happens a lot with researchers, is they produce these materials but never actually present back to the community members themselves, which is something I was trying not to do. So that definitely helped. And then to break down the role of researcher even more, where I was living is a very small community. It's something I'm used to growing up in. So honestly, I met so many folks just walking through different communities, being invited over for lunch. And so I got to meet a ton of folks even before this research took off. And word spread of this random white woman in the community, which also helped my case of just breaking down this researcher role from Ateneo, especially being from Ateneo. There's this hierarchy in the Philippines for that as well. So yeah, just getting to know people and reassuring everyone that the work I was producing was for them and not necessarily for me or my next academic achievement. Yeah.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, so I just wanted to hone in on what you mentioned, that it's not just doing research for research's sake, but rather conducting that actionable research that is, at the end of the day, very transparently for the community benefit. And I would maybe like to invite you to also maybe extend on that, because I'm also taking from our previous session with Dr. Maria Barbosa, where it's not just doing research for the community, but rather doing research with the community. And I would argue that that's something that you were also actively doing, because of the participatory mapping and the KIIs, and really being very respectful of all of these unique and diverse perspectives from all of these stakeholder groups, which is no easy feat in itself to gather so many diverse groups together. And so I do want to just use this opportunity to, sorry, if you wanted to share anything before we move on to the next question.
Yeah, no, I would say that's great. Yeah, I would say definitely participatory. The results I have, I'm hoping will be shared out to all of the participants who joined my focus group discussions. The goal is that they can act as advocates for themselves as well, because one of the things that came up in the focus group discussions is they didn't know who to talk to. They didn't know how to talk to officials and show them that these were challenges they're facing. So now I hope with these reports and these discussions, I kind of kick-started at the municipal level, they can continue being advocates for themselves and build on this work.
Yeah, I think that's that's a great way to describe it now. So trying to help them recognize that they can advocate for themselves and that they are active agents rather than just passive victims of all of these hazards that, as you mentioned, they're so used to that they become so used to it's become a way of their life. And because of that, they also have this great breadth of and depth of knowledge to draw from. And so I do want to share this next question and a comment as well from Dr. Chitra Grace from the Zoom chat. And Dr. Grace says, wonderful work, in-depth and action-oriented. Just curious to know if there was any insight into health system access and preparedness in these areas. So seeing health as a lens of resilience.
Yeah, that wasn't a strong focus in my discussion groups, but I can speak on a personal level. In this area in the Philippines, or most likely throughout the province, access to healthcare systems are fairly limited, whether that be due to distance. I mean, there's rural clinics, but mostly it's due to economics. Even something 500 pesos, folks in my area, 500 pesos is about $8. Folks in my area could make as little as 300 pesos a day, which is about $4 to $5, which is about $150 to $200 a month. So I would say the biggest thing for healthcare is the cost in these areas, and then just general access to healthcare facilities. I can't speak on it in the terms of this research project, as more so personal experience I took note of while living in this area, just because, yeah, I was more focused on the experiences of the physical hazards and taking note of that. But yeah, great question, something to look further into.
Thanks, Alyssa. And as you mentioned, of course, there is always opportunity to expand on this study, given that Sablayan is just one part of the whole island of Mindoro. And so it's a really interesting way to also see, that interaction between people experiencing hazards, yes, but also having that high awareness, that high environmental literacy. One of the things that really struck me was how you were sharing about their high awareness, not just of the sources of the hazards that they experience, but also the role of the natural environment in acting as both a buffer, but also as sort of, for lack of a better word, an investment in terms of resilience. So it's really nice to hear, that kind of insight from the community. So I do want to also pivot to another question from our audience. This is from Marvin Tejada, and this is regarding the nature of the mapping that you conducted. And Marvin writes, I understood that this is a qualitative study focused on participatory mapping with focus group discussion. How has the on-the-ground analysis compared to the actual hazard maps as provided by government-supported agencies such as the Department of Science and Technology's Hazard Hunter tool or the UP Resilience Center's Project NOAA? And were there similarities, accuracies, deficiencies, or any other type of differences that you found notable?
Yeah, okay. One thing to note with those maps is that they're pretty generalized. So they map, if I remember correctly, they map this section of Mindoro as all like flood, as like a red flood zone, and it's not hyper local. So it doesn't pinpoint to specific points in the community itself. It's generalized. It doesn't break it all the way down to a street or a house or this specific coastline section. So it matches because it says this area is flood prone. I think it also takes note of maybe earthquakes, or like yeah, I think it takes note of earthquakes as well. But yes, so it's accurate in terms of the fact that it says it's flooding, but it doesn't go to this very hyper local barangay level look. Now, if I had the tools, I could probably develop an engineering flood model to this very hyper local level, but currently there's just not enough data to do so.
Thanks, Alyssa. So it's really a matter of scale, no, and trying to see, what is fit for purpose of a particular tool. For those who might not be familiar with the Hazard Hunter or Project NOAA, these are tools for mapping hazards across different parts of the Philippines, and sometimes it might be because it's useful for certain decision makers to have information up to until a certain scale only. And this is a problem that, of course, we who would like to have that hyperlocal information always grapple with, at what scale is enough or what scale is too much, perhaps. So speaking of scale, I do want to pivot and acknowledge Marvin's follow-up question to this. So earlier we talked about the scale on the national government level, which are these tools that are available to the public. So now I want to go a bit to the local part. So this is where maybe the local government or the barangay might play a more active role. And Marvin writes, I'd like to know if you have delimited your research with or without referring to existing community disaster risk assessments or land use plans or community development plans. These documents where municipal planners have already identified previously for comparative purposes based on different sources of data, and whether that played a role in your research.
Yeah, I did review those documents. So yes, the comparatively they show similar flood patterns. In terms of like development and looking into the priorities, there are sections in Poblacion where they're looking at planning opportunities for more seawalls. I didn't take note of that in this lecture, but that was something I talked about with the municipality leaders. Similar in Tabuk, I work closely with the planning office in the municipal. They're looking at developing a bridge and conversations around that, whether or not to build the bridge. The biggest thing, the gap that my research filled was developing this mechanism for continued community participation, but also something the municipal leaders talked about was they didn't realize that the drainage issue was throughout these three barangays. They were really focusing on Barangay Buena Vista drainage limitations, but continuously throughout three of these barangays, there are major drainage issues where the government officials don't even know where any of the drainage pipes are. They don't know where the water goes to during the flooding. They don't know if the seawalls are connected to the drainage pipes at all. And having that community support on these issues, they said, was going to be incredibly helpful in pushing the engineering office to really make a move on developing those drainage systems plans and doing something about it, because that was something they didn't realize the scale of the drainage issue was affecting this whole area.
Yeah. For those who have been paying attention to the news cycle in the Philippines, flooding is really such a hot topic, especially given how intertwined it is with how we balance our resources as a nation. But I also want to point out how interesting it is, where you mentioned that these authorities had no idea about how shared of a problem this was with neighboring barangays. So, maybe as a thought experiment, it would actually be nice to think that your research and your stay in Occidental Mindoro actually might have paved the way for them to collaborate across these different barangays and maybe come up with a unified hydrological study or a drainage plan, which might it underscores the principle that resilience also comes from collaboration, as you mentioned also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that would be great to see. Who knows? But it would, to hold out hope, it would be great to see a study like that done in this area. Yeah.
So I also want to revisit something that you mentioned in your previous answer, about these municipal level documents, and as someone who also works in the environmental space here in the Philippines, sometimes I know that these documents might also be produced externally, or are outsourced with the help of scientists, researchers who might not have a stake or who might not fully know or be embedded in the context of these coastal barangays. So this is where I think context really matters. So I want to ask, what were some of the differences perhaps in risk perception across the different sectors that you gathered that might have surprised you the most?
Do you mean across like the different sections, like the three different barangays, or the different stakeholders, like the women, fisher folk, tourism?
So more on the latter. So perhaps
Okay,
in the
okay.
same barangay, if you had, let's say, for example, community mapping. I noticed that you presented the heat maps earlier, but of course, heat maps tell us the frequency. But
Yeah.
perhaps I'd also be
Yeah,
interested
yeah,
in
yeah.
where the diversity of opinion might have surprised
Yeah,
you.
yeah. I can definitely highlight this. It kind of aligns with what you probably are initially thinking. The fisher folk were way more knowledgeable about what was happening in terms of the coastal hazards and the protective features. Most of the coral reef mapping, if you remember from Poblacion, was coming from the fisher folks themselves. When it came to women, they were more invested in the disasters and safeties, less, and also the sanitation in a lot of these communities as well, less so on the actual like fisheries management. And then for the tourism was again more for this environmental conservation and balance between fishing and environment and tourism. I would say the fisher folks also probably had the most pushback when it came to marine conservation, but mostly because they don't feel consulted enough when decisions are made at the level, at this community level. They feel like they're not involved, and that's where this pushback comes from because when an NPA is created, I think it's about, I forget the distance, but fisher folks have to go XYZ distance away from that marine protected area. So they're spending more money on oil, they're spending more time out on the water. So it's just, they want to have an open discussion with leaders about that. So yeah, I would say that's kind of how the divide fell. And I would say it was similar across Baranga as women kind of had similar ideas, tourism folks had similar, fisher folk had similar.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned involvement, and of course, you also mentioned the fuel crisis. So I guess this also drives home the point of how interconnected all of these issues are. You have your external socioeconomic issues that really affect how climate change and its secondary or tertiary impacts are felt on different levels of the community. It's interesting that you also mentioned involvement, and I also agree because based as well on experience and in previous fieldworks, the sentiment around marine protected areas or MPAs here in the Philippines is that they do enjoy a high amount of support even with fisher folk. But it is conditional with how involved they feel in the decision making process. So that's also where I want to zero in on this next question, which is that you mentioned a common theme, especially with Barangay Poblacion and Barangay Buenavista, as the participants wishing that there were more opportunities for community participation, more ways for them to really share their knowledge, but also their insights and opinions in resilience planning. So I'm curious if there were any mechanisms that were mentioned or which emerged for this participation to begin with, and what these might have looked like. Or were there really none at all, and this is something that communities have to build from scratch together?
Yes, several were noted both at the barangay level and the municipal level. There are several people's organizations throughout these two barangays. The issue is that a lot of them have dissolved, so there's no leadership or there's a lack of organization within the PO itself. Another is that they do have committees, so like fisheries committees, barangay level disaster committees. But oftentimes the issue I heard from the fisheries committees is that when they have a problem, they don't know who exactly to turn to. They don't know if it's like the fisheries organization, if it's the agricultural organization, if it's Menro, if it's Senro, if it's there's like all these different levels of environmental leadership, all these different levels for agriculture, all these different organizations for fisheries. So the biggest thing was like they didn't know who to turn to. And not only that, is that when they spoke to some of these leaders, they felt like what they were saying was never truly going to be incorporated into any type of change. So they started lessening their actions in these two areas. So hopefully this gives a platform to enable them to start trying to push for greater change by using leverage, their voice, their documents, these community maps as well. And also hopefully utilizing the power dynamic that I mentioned, that I was able to talk to these municipal leaders and share these insights. And so hopefully there's some push that way to enable more of these community members to find the right person and to talk to them as well.
Yeah, thanks, Alyssa. That's really interesting because you mentioned that there are structures that are already in place, and there are mechanisms that were previously created, and I'm sure that these were created with the best of intentions. But I think what I'm getting from your answer is that it drives home the point that structures are not enough. It's also about continuity. It's also about how people engage with local democracies.
Mhm.
So this is really a really interesting, view around how these community resilience mechanisms can and should be sustained. So my question about this is regarding your presentation of this to the community leaders, and I'm really interested in how their reactions were when you shared these findings. And specifically, maybe not just about the findings with regards to, what were the common themes of their stakeholders, but also the common dream, I suppose, of that increased involvement.
Yeah, I feel like the municipal leaders are aware that there is a gap in this community participation. It came up in some of these interviews, so they were not surprised. Also, there is some tension between what fisher folk want, what the local government wants, what tourism wants, what the local government wants. So they weren't surprised. I think the biggest thing is just that there's like a lack of resources for this continued community participation, just a lack of funding overall. I mean, I was one person. It took me about a month or two to collect this data. So this could be one person's full-time job to be the community engagement coordinator. So where does that funding exist? How do you continually enable it? A lot of the municipal leadership, the pushback was just that these communities have people's organizations, they have these committees, they just need to enact them to connect with the right people. Yeah. So they kind of took off the responsibility and put it back on the community members to kind of be like, you have to organize yourselves, you have to find the right leadership, talk to your barangay captain, which, yeah, is the case in many places as well.
Yeah, that's interesting because there's that common recognition of that tension between leaders and between stakeholders, and it's sort of like a chicken and egg dilemma. Um, it, I agree that, and I found your answer quite insightful about how it sometimes comes down to a matter of funding and a matter of capacity. And sometimes funding is tied very intimately with policy. That's how structures are formed in these communities. And so I'm just going to paraphrase a bit on a question here in the chat by Marvin Tejada with regards to policy creation. Was this perhaps included, or did this emerge in your presentations and conversations with local leaders after your study?
I personally did not have enough time to look into the creation of policies or ordinances or regulations. I can speak on the fact that currently in Sablayan, they are updating fishery ordinances to make fishing more accessible when there are NPAs. I think they're creating a 3-zone rule now for some of these areas so that fisher folks can fish closer to some of these marine protected areas. Also, there are NGOs or nonprofits in Sablayan, one of which Blue Alliance, that works more on this policy focused or ordinance changed lens. For me, I was only there for 6 months, so really not enough time to do data collection, analysis, and advocating for a policy change. The hope is that I can pass these materials off to an organization or to people themselves. Yeah.
And yeah, and with that, I also want to, I would have commented, but I think it's better for me to read Chitra Grace's comment here in the chat. Thanks for sharing your perspective. Climate change is indeed a multiplier of inequities already existing in the area. And she also shares your hope that the mapping will help and empower the community to become more resilient. So yes, hopefully this is just the start of a much longer pathway and much longer journey to capacity on the stakeholder level, but also resilience on the larger community level. And so, as a last question, because I'm also aware of the time that we have for the open forum, if people in the audience want to stay updated with the work that you're doing, what is the best way for them to stay in touch?
If you're Filipino, add me on Facebook. That's definitely where a lot of my updates have been for this project, and that's also how I stay connected to the community members itself. I still message folks from Sablayan. I think I've messaged them every day since I've left Sablayan, at least someone from that region. So you can look me up on Facebook. It's my name, and it'll say Fulbright Researcher in the Philippines. More professionally, most likely LinkedIn, or you can message me in the chat for an email if you want to stay updated as well. Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you, Alyssa, for your answers. This has been quite an engaging open forum. And of course, thank you to our participants for also sending in your very interesting questions for this session. And so we now move to the awarding of the certificate. We are happy to present this certificate, and I'll just read the citation. This certificate of appreciation is presented to Alyssa Kemp for sharing their time and insights in the webinar entitled Community Perspectives on Coastal Resilience, a baseline assessment of 3 coastal barangays in Sablayan, Occidental Mindoro on the 17th of June, 2026. The certificate is signed by myself as the focal point of the MCR-Ateneo Hub and by Dr. Emmanuel De Locado, the director of the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability. The signed and high-resolution copy will be sent to Alyssa's email after this session. So thank you very much again, Alyssa, for sharing your time and insights with us. And now, to deliver the closing remarks, it's my pleasure to call on Dr. Emmanuel De Locado, the director of the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability. Dr. De Locado, thanks for joining us.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this webinar entitled Community Perspectives on Coastal Resilience, a baseline assessment of 3 coastal barangays in Sablayan, Occidental Mindoro. I hope you find it as fruitful as I did. Many thanks for your questions, comments, and reactions, which are very exciting and insightful. The talk by Ms. Alyssa presented key highlights of the research and experience of our speaker in months-long engagement in Sablayan. We saw through focus group discussions and just informal community engagement and interactions the level of environmental literacy and disaster resilience of the communities. It may not be the same language that we use, but there is a knowledge to be tapped, such that we can have a clearer and more holistic understanding of our common home and appropriate response to communities. It is important to free up the voices. And research such as done by Alyssa in his short stay in Sablayan allowed us to elucidate these voices. Discussions on sustainability and resilience has always been demonstrated to be asymmetrical and disproportionate, with the party dominating and even directing the discussion, which often disregards the local voices. From this webinar, we heard the voices of the community members and leaders, but these voices are not just voices, but actual people. And these people are actual or active agents in their resilience. Moreover, the knowledge is shaped by the lived experience of the community members. It is notable that there are structures and mechanisms in place in terms of local governance, but these need to be accessible to the local communities themselves. This punctuates the need for more bottom-up resilience mapping, such as the study done by Alyssa. As we draw the program to an end, thank you. We wish to extend our gratitude to our resource speaker, Ms. Alyssa Kemp, for sharing your time and expertise. She is a visiting Fulbright Research Fellow at our institute, at the Institute of Sustainability. And before she went to Sablayan for fieldwork, she has engaged different groups within the university as well. I also would like to thank our secretariat, Daniel and Ivy, as well as our FSL interpreters, Ms. Edna and Ms. Anna. And I would like to thank the numerous network partners who made this webinar successful. And of course, last but not the least, thank you everyone for your active participation and for your questions. We hope that we can keep the conversation going, especially to our peers and colleagues who are not too versed in discussions on sustainability, resiliency, and local communities. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you very much, Dr. Delocado. Indeed, there is much to be gained when we are humble enough and aware enough to integrate knowledge from traditional academia and community perspectives. And so at this point of the program, may I please request everyone to turn your cameras on momentarily for our group photo. This will serve as our session's documentation. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces, but also great to see a lot of new faces joining us. So thank you and welcome, everyone. I'll just give a few moments for the rest of the audience to also turn on their cameras if you're comfortable with it. So I will be taking a screenshot of the first page. Okay, so please keep your smiles on, right? Taking the first screenshot in 3, 2, 1. I'll now be taking a screenshot of the second page, so please keep your smiles on. Now taking the second screenshot in 3, 2, 1. And for the last page, taking the screenshot in 3, 2, 1. Thank you so much, everyone. It's great to see so many faces, so many new faces joining us in what is our last session. And so while today's session might mark the end of our webinar series, I do want to thank everyone, regardless of whether you've been with us since the start of our twin series back in April or at the start of this particular series in May. Or even if it's your first time joining us, we hope you learned a lot in our short time together. If any of this has piqued your interest in our work at the MCR-Ateneo Hub, why not visit one of our featured projects? We have built a steady repository of Climat articles, which is a play on the Filipino phrase climate and, to explore the connections between climate change and the everyday. Another featured project is the Climate Stories Initiative. We believe that we are all storytellers and scientists, and if you have a story about how climate has impacted you, we are interested in reading it. Together, we hope to build up a Southeast Asian, if not a Global South voice. But more than that, more than just a compilation of stories and experiences, we also hope to have a series where risk perception is seen. And so you may visit the site on screen to access the guide questions and select a few as your prompts or your guides. And lastly, to our dear participants, please answer the evaluation survey with the QR code and link flashed on screen. We kindly ask that you share your honest insights about the webinar to help us improve our future events. Requests for e-certificates may also be coursed through the same form, and these certificates will be released around a week from completion. Thank you again to Ms. Kemp. Thank you, Alyssa. And we'd also like to thank our sign language interpreters, Ms. Edna Comia and Ms. Annalisa Regis Tolentino, for making all of our events more inclusive. And to all of you, thank you very much for your participation in this webinar. We hope you have gained fresh insights, not just on coastal resilience, but also on how to conduct research as a form of care and empowerment. Please don't forget to accomplish our event evaluation form and visit the other links that our team has posted in the chat. Again, requests for e-certificates may be coursed through the same form. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. I'm happy to give back 5 minutes of your time.